Hello and welcome to the Sprint 142 review. As usual, I'll provide an overview. Harpreet will fill us in on the UI, Adam on the providers, Joe V on the platform, Alberto on the API, and Jason on the developer experience. So this sprint, we merged 142 pull requests and 168 were opened. So it's roughly in line with Sprint 141. So not much changes there. In terms of bugs versus enhancements, we also kind of held steady against Sprint 141. So an even split between bugs and enhancements. And there was a bunch of other things that were done in the purple, which are usually us just trying to improve the developer experience. I broke out the health into two slides now because they was getting too big. So in terms of the health of the core repositories, here you have it, still working on the graph to show changes over time. And then on the provider repositories, we have all of these providers. A new one to join the list is NSXT, which we hope to include with the Kasparov release. Speaking of releases, we during this sprint, we released the Yansa release candidate 1. And barring any major kind of reports of issues, we will be releasing that shortly as GA and changing our focus to the Kasparov release. And with that, I will turn it over to Harpreet.
Thanks, Oleg. Hello, everyone. Total of 24 UI PRs were merged during the sprint, mostly bug fixes during the sprint, 12 bug fixes and 4 enhancements. Some of the main bugs and enhancements are highlighted here with the links to the PRs. Next slide, please. So a flash message has been added to VM details screen. As you can see one here on the screenshot, if there has been a change such as increase or decrease in number of cores per socket while VM is running, a message will appear on the screen to inform user that the change will not be applied unless VM is restarted. Next slide, please. On the authentication settings screen, options LDAP S and LDAP were removed from mode dropdown. This change was made to remove deprecated MIQ LDAP in favor of external authentication. Next slide, please. There are several accordions in Control Explorer. Delete buttons for each of these entities in Control Explorer were changed to use React-based modal that goes through API to delete the selected objects. And that is all I have for the UI. Over to Adam.
Thanks, Harpreet.
Trying to move to the next slide here. 1 second. Go.
There we go. Thank you.
Yep.
So for core this sprint, we did a couple of nice enhancements to the inventory collections and the persister classes. So we renamed the key pairs inventory collection so that the auto model class would work. Essentially what was happening was every provider subclass was having to override the model name for key pairs because even though the association is called key pairs, the model class is auth key pairs. So we renamed that so that we could delete a bunch of overrides from the provider classes. We also allow providers to now manually specify the provider module name. Before it would just detect it as, providers something, and you couldn't change it at all. So this allows a little bit more flexibility for providers who want to change the way that their namespacing works. We'll make use of this shortly. For Amazon, Dan fixed a couple of issues related to targeted refresh. So volume updates were not triggering a targeted refresh because we weren't parsing the volume ID properly out of the event. So we fixed that up nicely. And also network ports and security groups were having their names not displayed properly. So the name was actually in a separate tag group compared to what we were normally seeing with like instances. So he looked in another set of tags for the network ports and security groups to show the names properly. On Ansible Tower, a few sprints ago, we fixed an issue where invalid YAML was coming back, causing the refresh to fail. Turned out that when that happened, we had already created a partial object, and so that was causing some other things to fail down the line. So we changed around the order of how we're parsing things to only create the object once all of its attributes have been properly parsed. Next slide. In OpenStack, this was all about metrics performance this sprint. So we were previously getting a list of all the counter names per VM as the first API call when we go to collect metrics. These things don't change all that often, and it was incurring a lot of overhead for the extra API calls. So Andre changed it to cache the counter names for an hour, which is similar to what we do on VMware. And then Marek also updated the call to get the network interface counters to reduce the amount of data returned. Essentially, we were only interested in a single counter type, but we were asking for everything and then filtering it down later. So now we're only asking for that one interface counter name. On vSphere, we're now running post-refresh after the streaming refresh finishes. This was causing some things like event reconnect to not run properly. So now we're doing that, which is in line with the rest of the refreshes. And for Smart State, Jerry fixed some symlink processing that was causing some packages to get missed. And that is it for providers. Over to Joe.
Oh, busy sprint for you guys. In the platform space, there were 28 PRs merged this sprint. The highlights are multiple enhancements were contributed across multiple MIQ repositories that will help developers by allowing them to run Rails commands such as the Rails console directly from the MIQ plugins. And I listed a couple of them here, a couple of the PRs here that fell into the platform space, and Jason will discuss it more on a developer slide. For bugs, one was fixed where Journal D was not correctly logging the source of all the log messages, so it was kind of hard to find out where messages were coming from. Now they should be a lot more useful. Another was fixed where some of the codified workers were being killed during normal operations due to low memory allocations. And lastly, I like to list all the PRs in the build space for those who are working on their own build, just as reference. And that's it for the platform space, this sprint, and on to Alberto.
Yep, thanks, Joe. So for the API, initially the API used to not return null attributes for resources, but we had changed that a while back, so it does. But that was never done for virtual attributes, relationships, as such. So with this fix here, if you ask for an attribute that's virtual attribute, relationship, or empty, or a one-to-many association, you will get the nulls back as shown here. For VM safe import, direct service, and files as an example. So that's it for the API. Next slide.
Okay, on the developer slide, we removed MIQ Spartan in favor of Foreman. MIQ Spartan was a environment variable that you could pass some comma-separated roles, and it was similar to EVM start in that it would start some workers for you, but only the ones you specified. And since then, we've switched to using the Foreman tool, unrelated to the Foreman provider. And there's a file in the root called procfile that you can use where you can specify the workers and any parameters for them. So that removing MIQ Spartan was a lot of code changes, and hopefully it'll clean things up. And as Joe said, we added app path environment variable to all of every single plugin. And what that allows developers to do is run a Rails server, Rails console directly in the plugin. And the big thing there is if you're a plugin developer, you don't necessarily have to have a complete copy of the ManageIQ repo elsewhere where you have to switch over and run Rails console from there and then switch back to your plugin. Ideally, you should be able to stay right in your plugin. Should make it a little bit easier for plugin authors. And that's it on the developer side.
All right. And I think that wraps our sprint review. So thanks everyone for contributing. Thanks everyone for presenting. And we will be back in 2 weeks to review the next sprint, 143.